Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, you would have got the impression, and I think it's a correct impression from some of the talks we've heard today so far, that things are trending in a comfortable direction. It looks as though with the spread of enlightenment, the spread of literacy, the spread of scientific knowledge, that more and more people are coming to think, along with Dan Dennett, that they might be atheists. And that's good news. It's supported by a lot of empirical data, for example, from Pew polling results in the United States, which we think of as a country, a sort of God-besotted country, where increasingly, especially among under 35s, larger and larger proportions of the population are saying that they have no religious affiliation or commitment. But it's important to look back across the landscape of history a bit to understand what the present phenomenon is in this discussion, sometimes rather bad-tempered discussion between people who retain a religious commitment and those of us who don't. To look back, for example, at the 16th century after the Reformation, when the Roman Catholic Church, which had been the church in the West, lost a great deal of influence and control over great swathes of Europe, and it fought back very bitterly. Same thing happened in the 19th century after Darwin and after the movements in the second half of the 19th century, stemming from the scholarship, especially in Germany, but also in the UK, questioning the historicity of the Bible and showing that the Bible of religion, at any rate, was a document made by many people, many texts over a very long period of time, and that there were spurious interpolations in it. And these were anxious times for people of faith, and they did the same thing as they did in the 16th and 17th century, and that is they fought back, much as a cornered animal might do. And I think we're witnessing the same phenomenon now. After what we refer to as 9/11, there's been a polarization, quite a dramatic one, in the debate over religion and its place in the public square. And a lot of people who have had a residual religious faith have come out much more openly and strongly in support of their faith. And a lot of people who didn't care about religion very much and didn't really bother to take part in these discussions realized that they had a commitment on the other side of the argument, the non-religious side of the argument, and felt that they had to step up too and be part of the discussion about what we're to do about the effect, the influence, the place of religion in our public policy discussions, in our education, its effect on science, and in particular, the effect that it has on individual lives of women, of gays, of minorities in countries where religious zealotry is a major influence. And so the trend that we've seen, especially in more advanced economies in the world over the last couple of centuries, and in particular the dramatic change to the historical rhythm introduced by the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which earlier on Peter Singer was talking about, referring to Steve Pinker's book, where that development to greater peace and cooperation among people became more pronounced as a result of the 18th century Enlightenment. That trend is a good and a positive trend, and it's one that we, on this side of the debate, need to capitalize on. So we asked the question, what next for atheism? What should people, with our view of things, be thinking about doing to try to make sure that this, the healthy trend continues, even though, of course, it's going to be a work of long breath, as the French say. It's going to be many decades, perhaps even centuries, before finally humanity is liberated from its past, the deep roots in ignorance and superstition, which we now think of as the established religions. I think there are three areas we need to focus on. One is the question of the metaphysical debate, the debate about the nature of the universe that we occupy. Of course, physics and cosmology tells us a very great deal about that, and Lawrence is going to tell you about that in a little while. But the metaphysical aspect of it is a debate about whether or not, in addition to all the forces and entities described by physics, there is something else. Are there supernatural agencies? Are there gods and goddesses, angels and archangels? That discussion, the metaphysical discussion, is one which still needs to be pursued. we still have to have a conversation with people who want to believe that there are agencies of that kind. And that's a discussion about rationality, about evidence, about our understanding and the way that we achieve further understanding about the nature of the universe. The second debate is a debate about secularism. It's a debate about just where religious organizations, the religious voice, is positioned in the public debate and its influence on government policy and its place in education. And the third, and in some ways, perhaps the most important one, because it is the one which might most quickly help people who are wavering in their views about religion or who would like to be able to free themselves from religion, is the debate about the ethical, about our lives, about how we live them and make decisions about what sort of communities we're going to construct and what the basis of our relationships with one another should be. And this is a very, very important one. This is why a lot of people who don't have a religious commitment commit themselves to a humanist view of the world. And by a humanist view, I don't mean anything very elaborate, just the view that our ethics, our attitude towards other people, and our sense of our responsibility to them should be premised on our best, most generous, most sympathetic understanding of human nature and the human condition. So that's a point I'll come back to in a moment. The first point about the metaphysical discussion. What kind of place is this universe and what does it contain? Well, I'm very diffident and indeed reluctant to disagree with anything that Dan said a little while ago. When Dan suggested that what we should do is just slip in little atheistical comments like Walt Disney was an atheist. By the way, I didn't know that, so that's something good to learn. Some people still believe that there are gods and so on. That little remarks like that just dropped in would help people to get a kind of perspective, a sense of perspective on what they hear from other resources. But I have a little anxiety about that in the following way, that for very good evolutionary reasons, children are very gullible, very credulous. And the things that adults on whom they rely in their immediate circle say about the world are important to children. Fire burns, buses run over you, so you must be careful, you must do this, you mustn't do that. These are things that children have to believe. They have to be very, very accepting of what is offered to them on the authority of the adults in their circle in order for them to survive. So they are prepared to believe everything. They believe in fairies, they believe in the tooth fairy, for example, believe in Father Christmas. I mean, I've been bringing up my youngest child as an atheist. My wife says to me that means she'll probably, want to be a mother abbess when she's a teenager. But we learn the lesson from the religions that if you can indoctrinate them early enough, they will always revert to type later. So I've been bringing her up to say, never to use the word God, but always to use the phrase gods and goddesses. I also point out to her that when people use the word God with a capital G as if it were a name, as if it referred to something, that she should ask the people who do that to substitute the name Fred, because then it shows the vacuity of what they're saying. And who created the universe? Fred. And then you suddenly see that it's actually not explanatory at all. Or who says that you shouldn't lie or you should honor your mother and your father? Fred says it. Well, once again, you see the vacuity of it. So I've always taught her to say gods and goddesses, and she said to me one day when she was about 7 or 8, she said, I don't believe in gods and goddesses, but I do believe in the tooth fairy. And I said, well, that's actually pretty smart of you because there's much more empirical evidence for the tooth fairy than there is for God. And I could leave it up to her to find out, as she did at the age of 10 or 11, that there wasn't a tooth fairy and that there wasn't Father Christmas. And by the way, I mean, she was quite serious about Father Christmas. She came up to me about 2 Christmases ago, in fact, and said, don't tell Mummy, but I know about Father Christmas. But don't tell her about it, because she likes to believe that I still believe that there is Father Christmas. So that was a bit of nuanced thinking also. But she's an example of how children can accept anything, can accept the fairy stories, can accept the legends, can accept the religious teachings of their community, can believe in the tooth fairy and in Father Christmas. But the one thing which retains powerful social reinforcement after they've given up their credulity in things like Father Christmas is religion. If you live in a Christian community, you're surrounded by churches, there are church services on the radio, there's Christmas, there's Easter. We talk about the Church of England, C of E, Christmas and Easter, that's what most people go for. But the fact that they still go for it is a reinforcement. And so children continue to think that there must be something serious behind it if so many grown-ups get dressed up like the Archbishop of Canterbury and appear on telly. The Father Christmas thing and the Tooth Fairy thing don't get reinforced in that way. And therefore, there is a job of work to be done. The job of work involves trying to get people, children especially, to think a bit critically about the sorts of things that people believe and why they believe them. This is a very, very familiar point. You want to demand of people that they be rational in their beliefs. And what you mean by rational is that there should be a ratio, a proportion, between the grounds that they have for thinking something about the world, the beliefs that they hold, and those beliefs themselves. That if somebody makes a claim about how the world is, that they've got to come up with a robust case, and they should be open to having that case examined. And they should explain to you what would count as confuting or even refuting that case. And if they don't do that, if it's a matter of bare assertion or appeal to tradition or appeal to authority, that can't be good enough. And so that's the job of work that we have to do on the metaphysical front. And it has to be done in a number of different ways, not just by addressing the claims made about the nature of the universe, that it was created by a powerful agency designed on purpose to fulfill certain functions and so on. Not just that, but also by inviting people to think a little bit about the origins and the history of the religions. To look, for example, at how the religions have behaved in history, and to ask whether that stands up to any kind of justifying case for them. It is written somewhere, I forget where, by their fruits ye shall know them. Well, indeed, look at their fruits. Look at how history is panned out under the government of religions. For almost all of human history, of recorded human history at any rate, there have been religious leaders, religious teachers, the influence of religious beliefs in society, and we can ask ourselves quite legitimately the question, how has that been for humankind? Has it on the whole been a successful story? And that's something that we should challenge people to understand, because it's been a very important feature of the way religions have survived, not only that they proselytize young children, and adults, parents teach their children the same beliefs that their own cultural tradition treasures, but also because they've obscured facts about the past and reinvented themselves in ways that make them more acceptable to any present time. For example, the Church of England in the 1920s, at one of its synods, abandoned the doctrine of hell. We've seen just in recent years the Vatican apologize for its persecution of Galileo. By the way, the anniversary of the trial of Galileo was just 2 days ago, as you may know. Forgetfulness, amnesia about the past and about how the religions behaved in the past is very useful to them, because they can present themselves now as being positive agencies in our societies, doing charitable work, encouraging people to be kind to one another. They complain bitterly, apologists for religion, that atheists and secularists are aggressive and hostile to them in their criticisms of them. I always say, when people talk about militant secularism, I always say, look, when you guys were in charge, you didn't used to argue with us, you just burnt us at the stake. Now what we're doing is we're presenting you with some arguments and some challenging questions, and you complain. In fact, it was T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley, who in a letter to Darwin said, bishops are like, it was not a very kind remark this, by the way, but perhaps nevertheless true. He said, bishops are like pigs. If you poke one, they all squeal. And this is what's been happening in the last 10 years. Criticism is received as an offense, as an affront, and even rather reasonable people like Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, use this phrase, militant secularism. And I've always been surprised by that. I've often wondered, for example, what a fundamentalist atheist is. Fundamentalist atheist. Well, what would a non-fundamentalist atheist be? That's somebody who believes that a part of a God exists, maybe. like a left foot or a buttock of a God. Or that God exists on one day in the week, that's Sunday. That's actually what most Christians think, I think. So, I mean, it's very difficult to accept these charges of fundamentalism and militancy when, of course, one look at the landscape of history shows us what militancy and fundamentalism really does mean. So there is that discussion. We've got to look at the history of religions, at their origin, at how they've exercised their influence in history. We have to look at the claims that they make and the arguments they offer. And we have to do this rather as Aristeas, you may remember, I know you were all reading Virgil in the bath last night, so you were reading that story about how Aristeas had chased after Eurydice, thinking she was a deer. She was the beloved of Orpheus. And she stepped on a snake, the snake bit her, she died, she went down to Hades, and Orpheus, with his wonderful music, he went down into Hades to try and bring her back. And you remember that he made the great mistake because he was forbidden to turn around and look at her, and he did that. There are two stories about it, by the way. One is that he couldn't hear her. She was so light of foot that he didn't know that she was actually following him and that Hades had kept his promise. And so he had a quick peek to see if she was there. And sure enough, she was, but she was snatched back into the shadows because he had disobeyed the king of the underworld. And the other story is that she kept saying, Orpheus, if you don't talk to me and turn around and look at me, I'm not coming another step, and so on and so on. So finally, he did turn around and she was snatched back to the shadows again. But the point of the story is that Aristeas, who had caused this, in order to find out what he had done and to hear the story of Orpheus's tragedy with Eurydice, he had to go and capture one of the gods of the sea, Proteus. And as you see from the name Proteus, he had the power of changing himself into all sorts of beasts, animals, writhing serpents, fierce tigers. And Aristeas had the good fortune to have a river nymph for a mother, and she told him, just hang on to him, hold on to this Protean shape. And as he changes shape and changes into all sorts of different things, just hang on to him. And eventually, when he's exhausted all his metamorphoses, he will tell you why it is that you are being punished. And indeed, Aristeas hung on, and he got the story about Orpheus from Proteus. Now, the religions are like Proteus. You criticize them, you attack them, you advance arguments against them, and they immediately change into something else. They say, the apologists of religion say, that's not what I mean by religion, or that's not my understanding of God, or God is ineffable. Nobody can know what God is, and therefore you can't say that there isn't one. You can't prove that there isn't a God. That's not what I understand by my faith, and so on and so on. Just as Dan was saying, it's a swamp, a forest, a fog, and the goalposts, this is a tremendously mixed metaphor, keep shifting. But one has to be persistent, one has to hang on in there, one has to keep challenging them, to ask them what they mean. What is it that they're committed to? If they were going to convert you say, what is it that's going to convert me? Tell me why I should believe. What is the case? What are the grounds? And if there aren't any, if there is no cogent, rational, evidence-based, logical reason for doing it, then we have found the true source of a commitment of a faith nature, and that is that it is deeply and fundamentally an emotional commitment. And that's not an unimportant fact. That's a fact that I think we ought to address in connection with the ethical, with how we live our lives and how we respond to the universe and to one another. And that point I'll come to in just a moment. First, though, very briefly, the second point, the point about secularism. Now, we all know that what we mean by that is the separation of religious organizations, or the distancing of religious influences from matters of public policy. It's terribly important to iterate and reiterate as often as one can that nobody is saying that people are not entitled to believe whatever they like, providing it doesn't harm other people. So you can believe there are fairies at the bottom of the garden. You can even set up a church for that reason. You can try to persuade other people of your view. You can put your point into the public conversation about how things should be organized, and that's perfectly legitimate. And in an open, liberal with a small L society, nobody has a right to stop anybody else from trying to put a point of view. But for historical reasons, the religions have a massively overinflated presence in the public square. Look at the United Kingdom, or more particularly at England, that part of the United Kingdom, which has an established church, the Church of England. Now, about 3% of the population go on a regular basis to a church service. And yet, the Church of England has 26 bishops entitled to sit in the House of Lords and vote on laws that apply to everybody. There are at least four religious programs on the BBC, a publicly funded broadcasting service, every day of the week. Almost every major political and state event begins with prayers or has bishops or the archbishops present at it. So the presence of religion, this reinforcement, which our children are witnessing all the time, the fact that taxpayers' money is used to pay for faith-based schools. I mean, it's often seemed to me that the phrase Roman Catholic school is a kind of oxymoron. I mean, there's a big difference, isn't there, between religious studies, teaching people about religions, especially if you teach them about all the different religions so they can see how silly they all are. But it's a different matter having a school which is premised on a faith outlook, like Judaism or Islam or Christianity. And yet, in a society like England, English society, this is something which is publicly funded. I've always thought that you don't have to present an argument against faith-based schooling. You only need two words. And those two words are Northern Ireland. And if you mention that to anybody, they'll see the reason why ghettoizing people into faith communities and different faith schools is a terrible mistake. So for these historical reasons, the religions have this massively, massively over-amplified voice in the public debate. And what we should demand of them is that they see themselves for what they are. They are self-interest groups. They're lobby groups. They've got a point of view. They've got beliefs. They want other people to share those beliefs, or they want to try to impose their outlook on life. I've never myself thought that there is any justification for the argument that says, I believe so-and-so, therefore you mustn't do such and such, which is precisely what religious moralists are always saying. Some of you here may remember the great Mary Whitehouse. Do you remember her? Great moralist from the 60s and 70s. The only person in the universe who had a television set that didn't have an off button. So she used to watch everything. She was subjected to hours and hours of nudity on television, which she didn't want anybody else to see. And it always struck me as being very illogical that because she didn't like it, I wasn't allowed to watch it. And this is exactly the view that this voice in the public square is constantly telling us. We don't like this, therefore you mustn't do it. We don't like gays. We don't think that women should be, allowed to do anything at all except stay at home and do the washing up. Therefore, you must do likewise. No, they're interest groups, they're lobby groups. They're entitled to try and persuade us of their view of things, but they are on a par with trades unions, political parties, and other non-governmental organizations. They're civil society organizations. We shouldn't be funding them. They should be funding themselves out of their own constituency. And if they were to do that, and if they weren't allowed to proselytize children in faith-based schools because they weren't getting taxpayers' money for their faith-based schools, then the presence they have in our public square would be much diminished. And that would be a very good thing. And that, I think, is where the secular argument, that is where the secular argument must tend. We must make that case constantly for batting the religions and their organizations, the churches, back into their true perspective. Very often, I've told this to lots of people before, but it's a point worth iterating. I very often go on panels to discuss the secularism issue, the place of religion in public policy matters. And there are invariably 5 men. Always men, because there aren't very many women at the top of any religious organization. There are 5 men. There'll be a Jewish man, a Muslim man, a Catholic man, a Protestant man, and moi. And I am there because I'm a token atheist, secularist, humanist. I got the hairstyle so they didn't have to ask a woman after all. And I always begin the conversation by saying, the reason why there are 4 of them is that they don't agree with one another. In fact, for most of history, they've been fighting one another in the bloodiest of wars. Now they're all making common cause with one another because they want our taxpayers' money for their schools and so on. And then there's one of me. And between them, certainly in the UK, all the major religious groupings probably represent about 8, maybe at the utmost 10% of the population who are regular, committed, observant believers of their religion, who go to mosque or synagogue or temple or church on a very regular basis. And yet most people in the UK are functionally, at very least, secular. They don't want to be run by bishops or mullahs. They want to have an open, diverse, pluralistic public square where all views can be aired and tested, and where reason should govern. So that is an illustration, that panel of 5 people, 5 men, is an illustration of the tremendous imbalance in the public square introduced by the historical distortion of the fact that the temporal powers and the religious powers found one another so useful in the past. So that's a thing that in the future we atheists must contest and challenge. But the final thing is the question of how we live our lives, what kind of people we are, what sorts of relationships we develop with one another, what our ethical responsibilities and commitments are, and how we respond to the fact that we live in this universe and in a world, on a planet for which we have responsibility. Not any gods and goddesses, not any supernatural agencies, but we. Now, this is where the religions quite often think they can score, because they think that what they call spirituality and morality is a preserve of their own. They're the specialists in that matter. And the deep emotions that we feel, the capacity for and the need to receive love, and our enjoyment of beauty, the way we're moved by things like music, or our pity, our compassion for our fellow human beings when they suffer. The fact that as essentially social creatures, we need our bonds with one another. All these are facts about us which the religions exploit because they claim that they own those things. And I don't think that they do. I think that what we need to do on this front is to redescribe a great many of the things that we do in order to take back possession of them as those features of us, of our humanity, which are most important to us. We should redescribe, as what Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order, talked of, the spiritual exercises. We should describe a walk in the country, or listening to music, or having dinner with friends, or falling in love, or floating in a swimming pool, or lying in bed on a Saturday morning wiggling your toes. All these things are spiritual exercises. These are things that refresh us. These are things that make us feel that we inhabit a world which has many aspects to it that are good and rich and deep. And we don't have to run away to a temple or a church in order to give expression to those feelings. We should accept them as aspects, the best aspects of being human, of what human beings are. One of the things you were reading in the bath last night was David Hume and his views on religion. Indeed, rather more to the point, his views on the nature of beauty. Now, as you know, David Hume was a subjectivist. He thought that our valuations of things, both in morality and in aesthetics, were the result of our emotional makeup, and that we projected onto the world our valuations, so that there aren't beautiful things in the world, but we make things beautiful because we respond to them in the way that we do. Now, I happen not to agree with him about this. I think there are many, many beautiful things in the world, objectively so, on which many of us agree. A lot of human beings, just because of our shared nature, thrill to the same things very often. But the important point about Hume's view is that he thought that the fact that human beings find beauty in the world is a wonderful thing about human beings. The fact that human beings can fall in love, or can care about other people, or can show compassion and pity, he thought is a wonderful thing about human beings. I agree. I think these are remarkable things about us, and they're things to celebrate. Of course, there are many terrible things about us as well. But by the exercise of reason, of will, of the conversation that we have about the nature of the good in society, we have learned, as time has gone by, to be better at this business of relating to our fellows. Something which again, Stephen's very remarkable book suggests is the powerful trend running through history. So this side of us, this question of how we live our lives in our relationships with others and the world, addresses those things about us, that sense that we have sometimes of yearning for the absolute, or of wanting to celebrate the great interconnectedness of nature, or the fact that our emotions can be deeply stirred by things like the affections, or our own newborn children, or the success of our friends. But all these things are things about us. They don't need religion. They're nothing to do with religion. Religion has told us that all these good things come from the gods and all the bad things come from us. And that's not true. Everything comes from us, all our attitudes, and our intelligence, our educated sensibility helps us to try to capitalize on and to express better all those parts of us which make life really, really worth living. So if we can say we are now going to take back possession of all the positives, of all those things about us, about our friendship and about our enjoyment of being in this world, if we can do that, then we open a door of invitation to people who think that they could only express that part of themselves by getting involved in some mumbo-jumbo, which is not necessary. So the future of atheism turns, I think, on a number of things. We have a kind of breeze at our backs. The trend of history, at least in the developed countries of the world, is on the whole a positive one. But we should capitalize on it. We should challenge the claims of religion. We should challenge them over the history and the origins of faiths. We should try to pin them down on what it is they really do say and mean. We should conduct that argument about the public space, about just how loud a voice we will allow anybody in the public space, demand of any voice in the public space that it should be proportional to its actual constituency. And finally, we should say that the great question of how we live our lives for the good is a question for us as human beings, and we don't need to invoke something transcendent, something outside the world to explain it or justify it or motivate it. And I think that if it were possible, if only they would get on with the stem cell thing so we could all live another couple of centuries, that we would see probably over that period of time that this trend will continue, enhanced by the campaign that we as atheists can mount on those three fronts. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. AC Grayling, ladies and gentlemen.